What's up guys, Sean here, and today we're going to talk about the Young Turks essentially turning their network into a Bolivian propaganda arm. But before we get started, yes, I'm wearing one of my shirts that's at my Teespring store. Yes, you can buy this shirt at my Teespring store. Yes, there's a link in the description to my Teespring store. And no, you don't have to mortgage your house to buy this. I know many of you are willing to sell your car, sell your kidney, sell one of the organs that you can literally not live without in order to get one of these. But if you go to my Teespring store, not only can you get it for $19.99, but on top of that, you use the promo code DUMBPROMO and you get 10% off, because everything needs a dumb promo, and I shall provide you with the dumb promos. Also, if you do end up buying something, tweet the picture of you wearing it at me, and I will put your picture in this video and use your picture of you buying something from me to promote more people buying stuff from me. It will become a vicious cycle on this channel that will just keep perpetuating itself until the end of time. Participate in that vicious cycle. Also, there's other support links and blah, 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 blah. Let's get into the topic of the video because nobody wants to hear any of this. So one of my absolute favorite parts about watching and engaging with a lot of left-wing media is that you tend to find patterns of hypocrisy that pop up over and over again amongst leftists covering the news. And one of those recurring patterns that you tend to see amongst left-wing media, and the Young Turks is no exemption to this rule, is the consistent defending of left-wing authoritative regimes as long as those regimes espouse left-wing values. Now, one of my favorite examples of this, and it was a video that I actually didn't cover on my channel, comes from the Young Turks, and it's the video that they made where they talk about the collapse of Venezuela, and they try to convince you against all reason that the collapse of Venezuela had nothing to do with socialism or socialist policies, and then throughout the course of the video, they start naming, basically listing off all of the terrible socialist policies that led to the collapse of Venezuela. Now, the absolute best part about that, of course, is that they blame the collapse of Venezuela on the fact that Venezuela is oil rich, because according to them, oil bad, because I guess climate change. So if you're a country that has a lot of oil, then your country will end up being bad, which is really weird because they seek to emulate Norway. That's the new socialist country that they want to go after, even though Norway isn't really socialist. And Norway is wealthy largely on the back of their oil industry. So if oil's bad and the oil made Venezuela collapse and not the socialism, then why is Norway good when the difference between Norway and Venezuela is the fact that Norway isn't actually socialist? But whatever, that time has passed, even though the Venezuelan crisis is still going on. But it's now time that we move on to the new Latin American country that the Young Turks has decided to do propaganda for. And that is, according to them, their video that they put out about the coup that went on in Bolivia.
Military coup has occurred in Bolivia, forcing its president, Evo Morales, to step down.
I wonder how many times Anna's gonna say military coup in the video. I know it's a lot because I've actually already seen the video, but I'm just gonna play a couple of them for you.
A military coup, this military coup, this military coup, this military coup. This was a military coup.
Now, upon my first watch of this video, when I heard Anna bring up that this was Bolivia's first indigenous president.
Now, there is reason to believe that this military coup has the United States written all over it, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But first, let me just note that Morales was Bolivia's first indigenous president.
Somewhere in the back of my mind was like, Anna and the Young Turks are gonna somehow make this about race and racism, and I'm going to laugh at that if and when that happens. And I don't want to spoil the end of the video for you, but it totally happens.
I want to note, Morales wasn't perfect, okay? So I don't want this to be a one-sided story. This was a military coup. I disagree with it. It was, again, it has the United States written all over it, and it's wrong.
All right, so this is one of my favorite parts about this video, because this is a part where Anna Kasparian is going to pretend to be a journalist delivering you both sides of the information, but she can only pretend to do so for about 50% of a sentence. She's like, look, I'm gonna give you both sides because this guy wasn't perfect, but military coup, military coup, military coup, military coup's totally wrong, and the US probably did the military coup. I don't know if you know that, the US probably did this, they're behind this, it's wrong, Morales is great, but I'm gonna give you both sides of this.
But one of the things that some liberals in America keep latching onto is what happened with term limits in Bolivia. Now, back in 2009, there were term limits. You could only ultimately get reelected one more time. You can serve 2 terms. But Evo Morales actually worked with the Constitutional Court to do away with that term limit.
It's actually quite amazing how bad at being a news organization the Young Turks is. I mean, they look the part. Like, look at that set. Very professional looking set, especially by YouTube standards, where most people are just filming in their room with a desk behind them and a rabbit mask for some odd reason. They got a legit set. So you would think that with that legit set, obviously with some money backing them, that they would be able to correctly give you some facts that are really easy to look up, because if they got those facts wrong, or dare I say, were lying about those facts, you would easily be able to check that and prove that they were getting those facts at least wrong, at worst lying. And to give you an idea of what I mean, Morales was running for his 4th term in a nation where it is illegal for the president to run for more than 2 terms. Now, the way he was able to run for the 3rd term is that he got the Supreme Court equivalent of Brazil to rule that the constitutional provision that specifically limits the president to 2 terms doesn't apply in this case for some odd reason. But to be completely fair to Morales, even though that sounds really shady, that he got the Supreme Court equivalent of Bolivia to rule that something specifically in the Constitution, term limits, doesn't apply to him, after he won his 3rd term, he actually put the issue on the ballot so the people of Bolivia could decide for themselves if they wanted term limits removed from the Constitution or they wanted to limit the president to just 2 terms. And the people of Bolivia rallied behind their beloved president and voted to keep term limits in place, at which time Morales went to the court again and he argued that it was a violation of his human rights for him to not be able to run in perpetuity, and the court ruled that that provision just no longer existed in the Constitution because that's how crappy Latin American governments are run and crappy Latin American constitutions are, apparently. Oh, by the way, the justification Morales used to subvert the referendum, aka the will of the people, when it came to term limits, was that the people were propagandized by the United States of America, so their judgment could not have been trusted. Now, if the referendum would have went in his favor and term limits would have been abolished by the will of the people, I'm sure he would have held up that same referendum as evidence that he should be able to run for president forever.
Yeah, so 2 things about that. Look, I'm not a big fan of that either, but now let's give you context. First of all, so their Constitutional Court is our Supreme Court. So there was a guy named Powell who wound up becoming Justice Powell, who wrote a memo saying for the Chamber of Commerce when he was a lawyer for them, saying we should take over the Supreme Court and other institutions in America. So Nixon eventually saw that memo, said, well, I like this guy letting big corporations take over the Supreme Court. And he literally put Powell on the Supreme Court.
Oh my God, that's so embarrassing. Cenk Uygur is currently running for Congress. He is running for Katie Hill's old seat, California 25. And this is the kind of whataboutism, look over there argumentation that Cenk Uygur brings to the table.
And so he packed the court with his favorites, and eventually the court said, yes, corporations can give unlimited money to politicians, which allowed corporations to buy all of our government. So you're telling me, oh, Latin America is corrupt. Well, our Republicans stacked the court so that corporations can buy our entire government wholesale.
So because a lawyer wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce explaining how the Supreme Court in this country has basically become the be-all end-all when it comes to checking your policy decisions, that it would be important and good strategy for the Republicans to appoint justices that reflect their values to the Supreme Court, and that guy ended up on the Supreme Court. And something about corporations being people that I made a video on where I explained specifically that that's not what the court ruled, which will be linked in the iCard and the description box of this video. Therefore, it is okay for the Bolivian president to go to the court, get an exemption from something in the Constitution, put it up on a ballot measure, lose the ballot measure, and then go back to the court to get a permanent exemption. Yeah, those 2 things are totally equivalent. One was a memo about strategy within the current American system, and the other one was an obvious corrupt attempt to subvert the Constitution. But what's funny about this is that would Cenk, based on his support for the Bolivian president doing something like this, support Donald Trump asking the Supreme Court to get rid of the constitutional amendment that bars presidents for running from extra terms? Because I guarantee you Cenk Uygur wouldn't support that, but here it's totally okay. And his justification beyond that is even stupider.
But it's not just that. How about term limits? Well, New York has a term limit on mayors, but when Bloomberg didn't like it, he's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna run for a third term. What are you gonna do about it? But nobody ever called him a dictator.
As a general rule, it is a sign that your argument is not that strong when you continually jump from argument to argument in order to counter your opponent's points. So we just moved from Justice Powell, when he was a lawyer, writing a memo about strategy involving the Supreme Court, and then ending up on the Supreme Court, to Michael Bloomberg running for a third term as mayor of New York.
And in fact, the mainstream media kisses his ass day in and day out, including today, right? Like, oh, Bloomberg, oh, maybe he should be president. Maybe he should be president. Oh, he's got a real chance here, right? But when Evo Morales does the same exact thing, dictatorial, tyrannical, right? So then be honest and be objective. Are they both tyrannical? And will you call Mike Bloomberg tyrannical from here on out? If not, what are your standards, okay?
Now, first of all, and this will surprise none of you who have been watching my channel for long enough, I hate Michael Bloomberg. He is very authoritarian. The idea that somebody with that much money would go out of his way to run for mayor of a major city that he's not even from. He's from New England, he's from Boston. I don't know why he was running for mayor in New York. And then use his power as mayor to try and regulate how much salt you can have at restaurants, raise the age for tobacco. He tried to ban large sodas. Like, this guy has some serious authoritarian tendencies. That's why Reason would make a Nanny of the Month segment, and he would often be the Nanny of the Month, because Bloomberg loved using the nanny state to enforce what he believed to be right on the citizens of New York. Now, it needs to be pointed out that while Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, I, as a New Yorker, hated Michael Bloomberg. Cenk Uygur loved Michael Bloomberg for the vast majority of his term as mayor. In fact, he called him a modern-day FDR. But now Mayor Bloomberg is threatening to run against his boy Bernie Sanders, and he comes with billions of dollars, so Cenk Uygur doesn't feel that way anymore. Now, stop and frisk, totally not cool, so Cenk Uygur doesn't feel that way anymore. And he's using him as a tyrant comparison to the guy in Bolivia that he's defending.
They both turn tyrannical, and will you call Mike Bloomberg tyrannical from here on out?
Also, for this argument to hold any water, we all have to pretend that being a mayor of a city, a major city, the largest city in the United States, is somehow the equivalent of being a president of a country. Bloomberg's not even a governor, so while he did run for a third term when he wasn't supposed to run for a third term, there was no constitutional protections against a mayor of New York City running for a third term. Also, and I feel like Cenk Uygur should know this, but cities in the United States are chartered by the state governments, which means if Bloomberg would have went too crazy, Bloomberg would have gotten too out of line, the state legislature could have voted to remove him from office, or they could have voted to remove the charter for New York City and then reset it up and have new elections. So it's not the same thing to say that Bloomberg ran for a third term and he ignored that one check of term limits when there's all these other checks against the mayor of a city's power in the United States of America. The same thing is not true for the president of the country.
So Weisbrot made another great point. He said, look, when there was this slight irregularity where the vote counting was paused for a while in the middle of the election. And so Morales needs 10 points to avoid a runoff. But when they stopped the vote counting, he already had a big lead. And the rest of the counties were more indigenous areas where he does great. So the trend after they started counting the vote again was the same as the one before they started counting. And
so throughout this video, the Young Turks say, no evidence of fraud, no evidence of fraud. You don't even know there's evidence of fraud. In fact, the only organization that has pointed to or claimed fraud is an organization that's funded by the evil Americans. But Cenk just said that they stopped counting the election results, they stopped updating them for 24 hours. So on election day, the Bolivian people were getting updates on their election results periodically, like we would do from exit polling in this country. And then all of a sudden, the updates completely stopped for 24 hours. And then Morales has a gigantic lead, a lead that would allow him to avoid a runoff election. Now, I don't know how you can look at that obvious break in election procedure and decide that there's nothing suspicious here, there's nothing that should be looked into, everything's perfectly normal. Just because that's not how elections are supposed to be done in Bolivia doesn't mean that there was anything shady here.
When they stopped the vote counting, he already had a big lead. and the rest of the counties were more indigenous areas where he does great. So the trend after they started counting the vote again was the same as the one before they started counting. And
also, as far as I could tell, what Cenk Uyghur's saying about Morales' lead before the pause and after the pause is complete nonsense. Analysts were projecting the night of the election that there was going to be a runoff between the top two candidates. Then there's the 24-hour pause, and then all of a sudden, Morales is over the 10-point threshold that you need to avoid a runoff election. Now, maybe it was just an accident, and although this looks really bad and terrible and incredibly suspicious, maybe there was nothing wrong. But you can't blame people for thinking that there's something wrong, because it looks like there's something wrong.
Morales was democratically elected. Unless there is actual evidence to indicate otherwise, this is unacceptable. This was a military coup. And look, it is, I guess, consistent with how Republicans feel about election meddling, because they allowed Russia to meddle in our elections.
I just thought that this part of the video was funny because the whole time they're saying there's no evidence that there was fraud in Bolivia. They're making baseless claims about the election in Bolivia. And here Anna is making baseless, debunked claims about the Republicans coordinating with the Russians to interfere with the United States election in 2016. That did not happen. The Russians interfered with the election, but they were not coordinating with the Republicans. They were not coordinating with the Trump campaign. Remember the Mueller report? It found no evidence of such coordination. But it's the right that loves throwing around conspiracy theories about the legitimacy of elections, not the left. The left would never do that. There was nothing wrong there. 24-hour pause, dude, he's the president. Fourth term, and when it's only legal to run for 2 terms, nothing suspicious here. He's a socialist. That means he's good, and even if he breaks all these laws and he has all these corruption scandals, doesn't matter. It's amazing. It's amazing. Morales, 2020, whatever year, 2019, Morales forever.
And one final thing that I do have to mention, again, Morales was the country's first indigenous president. Prior to him, the country was ruled by a small group of elite who were descendants of European countries. Now, there is a component of this that is clearly racist. And Glenn Greenwald tweeted a video, which why don't we bring that video up now? And I'm gonna read Glenn's tweet as we watch it. Bolivian police cutting the indigenous flag, which had been Bolivia's second official flag, off their uniforms. This coup is literally the opposite of restoring democracy, which is how it's being depicted in Western press. It's violent, racist, imperial, Christian fanaticism.
Okay, now this is officially my absolute favorite part of this video, because not only is it a military-backed coup with no evidence whatsoever at all, nothing suspicious at all except for that 24-hour pause, but we'll ignore that and the big jump in the polls after that pause from before and after. Just forget about that, because now the coup is a racist coup. Can you see that? They're cutting up the indigenous flags that were placed on the uniform of the Brazilian soldiers. That flag is the second national flag of Brazil, and they are cutting it up because they're against the indigenous people and for no other reason. In fact, I guarantee you that there is no connection with that flag specifically and the president that they're getting rid of. It's all about racism and probably sexism and misogyny and Orange Man bad. I don't know what it's about, but it's definitely not about the current president.
Now, why do you cut the indigenous flag off if this isn't about race and this is about so-called voting irregularities? Or does that look a little organized to you?
Now, I may have given this away in my previous sentence, but I'm gonna explain it to you a little more clearly so that you get what I'm saying. That second flag, the second national flag meant to represent the indigenous people of Bolivia, was instituted in 2009. Morales ran for president and won the first time in 2006, which means he had a hand in putting that flag on the uniforms and making it the second national flag of Bolivia. In fact, the flag is directly associated with Morales, hence why people, after he was ousted, were cutting up the flag, not because they hated indigenous people, but because the flag was associated specifically with the president that the people think committed voter fraud and that they just ousted. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't racial or ethnic issues in Bolivia. Their indigenous population is 20%, and Morales was the first indigenous president in Bolivia's history. However, around 68% of the Bolivian population identifies as indigenous mixed, which is indigenous mixed with European and or African. So I'm guessing on the hierarchy of reasons why the Bolivians are happy and ousting their president, race is not high among them. I would guess that the potential for voter fraud and the president continuously violating the law and running for more terms and getting the kangaroo Supreme Court to approve of him violating the law to run for more terms is higher up on that list. But the Young Turks is either ignorantly consuming and then regurgitating to their audience far left propaganda that's making this somehow a race issue, or they're willfully misinforming their audience because they, like many far-left activists, like to excuse authoritarianism and corruption when that authoritarianism and corruption is disguised with rhetoric about helping the poor and socialism, Bernie McSanderson, and all that garbage. But those are just my thoughts. Please let me know yours down in the comments below. If you like this video, then please show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. If you'd like to support me, you can do so through a membership on this channel, or you can buy a shirt at my Teespring store, or you can support me monthly on Patreon Subscribestar, one-time donations, Venmo, PayPal. This has been me talking about the Young Turks doing Bolivian propaganda. Till next time.